Good morning, dear Sangha. Do you hear me well? Well enough? When I was young, as a novice monk, they told me that the Buddha does not suffer, and I believed them. But later on I found that the Buddha suffers like all of us. So there are people who ask the question, what is the use of becoming a Buddha if you still suffer? I want to practice and become a Buddha because I don't want to suffer anymore. But if you say that the Buddha still suffers, I have to reconsider. And in Plum Village we have learned and found out that the Buddha does suffer. Because he is a Buddha, but he is also a human being. Buddha is not a god. He is a human being like all of us. He has suffered, but he has learned and practiced. And he knows how to suffer. When you know how to suffer, you suffer much less. So there is an art called the art of suffering. We come to Plum Village, we learn that art, how to suffer. Because we know that if you know how to suffer, you suffer much less. Because in you there is understanding and compassion. And with that, these two energies, you suffer much less than other people. And also you can make good use of suffering in order to create joy and happiness. It's funny, but that is true. Suffering is useful. If you know how to make good use of suffering, and then you can create very wonderful things like compassion, understanding, love, happiness. It's like the mud and the lotus flower. You cannot grow lotus flowers if you do not have the mud. So those of us who know how to make good use of the mud, we can grow beautiful lotus flowers. And for those of us who know how to make good use of suffering, and then we can create compassion, understanding, happiness, and so on. So we can speak about the goodness of suffering. But many of us do not know that art of making good use of suffering. We do not know much about the art of suffering. We don't know how to suffer. Because if you do, and then you suffer much less, and then you can make good use of your suffering. I think 1 week is enough for us to learn these two things. And then as a practitioner, we should learn how to generate joy and happiness. With the practice of mindfulness and concentration, it is possible to generate a joyful feeling anytime you want. any time of the day. And with the practice of mindfulness and concentration, we can bring about a feeling of joy at any time you want to nourish yourself and help nourish the person you love. So all these things can be learned in the space of 1 week. And we should know how to make good use of the time we are together in order to learn and try these things, so that when we go home, we can continue how to create joy and happiness, how to handle pain, how to make good use of suffering in order to create happiness. We speak about the goodness of suffering, the usefulness of suffering, like the goodness of the mud, the usefulness of the mud, because we need the mud in order to make lotus flowers. And when you look into a beautiful lotus flower with the eyes of a practitioner, you can see the mud inside. The Buddha has suffered, and he learned how to suffer, and he was able to transform suffering into something else, like peace, happiness. But in our society, in our civilization, we are doing the opposite. We are always trying to run away from suffering. There is suffering inside of us. There is suffering in our family, in our society. And we don't want to get in touch with it because we feel that it's not pleasant to get in touch with suffering. And we pretend that suffering is not there. We try to cover up the suffering inside of us. And most of us do that. When we turn on the television and watch, it's not because the program is so interesting. Sometimes the film is not good, but we do not have the courage to turn it off. Because if we turn it off and then we have to go back and confront and touch the suffering inside. So television is one way to help us run away from ourselves. When we pick up a magazine to read, not because we are very eager to know what is going on in the world. Sometimes we watch the news 3 times a day. And we go to the internet, we look. We go and look for something to eat. We are not hungry. We don't need to eat. But eating for many of us is a way to forget for a while the suffering inside, the loneliness inside. So eating is one of the ways to run away from our own suffering. And the market provides us with all kinds of items to help us run away from ourselves, run away from our suffering. But the Buddha advised us to do the opposite. We have to try to go home and recognize the suffering in it and embrace it and look deeply into it. In that way, we will come to understand the nature, the roots of our suffering, and we see the way out, the way of transformation and healing. The way leading to the cessation, the transformation of suffering is in the suffering. If you look into the first noble truth, which is suffering, you see the second noble truth, which is the making of the suffering, and you see the way out, which is the fourth noble truth, Magga. Listening to our suffering, looking deeply into our suffering is a very basic practice. If we have the time to recognize the suffering, to look deeply into it, and to listen to it, and then understanding will arise. Understanding here is understanding suffering. Recognizing suffering and understanding suffering always bring about the energy of compassion. And that is logical. When you understand suffering, you become compassionate. And compassion is the kind of energy that has the power to heal. To heal suffering. Suppose you look at the other person. The other person may be your daughter, your son, your father, or your mother. Do you have time in order to look at him or her deeply? If you do, and then you will soon recognize the suffering in that person. Like yourself, he or she has a lot of suffering inside. And that person does not know how to handle the suffering inside of him, of her. And that person continues to be victim of their suffering. And when you suffer like that, you make people around you suffer also. Even if you don't want to make them suffer, you make them suffer anyway. And when you see that suffering in him or her, and if you understand the suffering in him or her, and if you see that that person is a victim of his own suffering, so far no one has helped him to handle the suffering inside and transform it. So you don't blame him anymore. You don't want to punish her anymore, because you have understood the suffering. And now you can look at that person with the eyes of compassion. Before that, you look with the eyes of anger and hate and the will to punish. But because you have seen and understood the suffering in that person, that kind of intention vanishes. And now you want to do something or to say something to help that person suffer less. It means compassion has been born in your heart. And compassion has healed you. You don't look at him or her with anger anymore. You don't have the intention to retaliate or to punish anymore. You want to do something to help. So it is very clear that recognizing suffering and understand suffering always bring about compassion. And compassion is the kind of nectar that has the power to heal you first. And then it will help heal the other person. So to meditate means to generate the energy of compassion. And compassion is born when understanding is there. And understanding is possible when you have the time to listen and to look deeply.